The morning shift bell rang across the Galactic Survival Academy, and Minji walked through the corridor with her backpack slung over one shoulder and her lunchbox tucked under her arm, because she had learned during her first week that the cafeteria, food was not made for human taste buds at all, and most of it smelled like cleaning chemicals mixed with old socks, so she always brought food from the human quarters. Now, and today she had packed her favorite sandwich with extra jalapeños because they reminded her of home on Earth, where her grandmother would grow them in the little garden behind their apartment building in Seoul. And the memory made her smile as she entered classroom 7B, where Advanced Toxicology 401 was held 3 times. A week in this class was mandatory for all cadets who wanted to work in diplomatic services or exploration teams, because you never knew what kind of dangerous substances you might encounter on alien worlds. And the academy took safety very seriously, which made sense since they trained people from over 40 different species, and each one had different biological needs and weaknesses and strengths that had to be considered in every lesson plan and simulation exercise they ran throughout the year, and Minji found it all fascinating, even though some of her classmates seemed nervous about today's scheduled activity, which was supposed to be some kind of toxin exposure drill that Professor Velxis had mentioned last week during the lecture on cellular defense mechanisms and chemical warfare agents that various species had developed throughout their evolutionary histories across the galaxy. She took her usual seat near the back window that looked out over the binary star system the station orbited, and the view never got old even after 4 months of classes, because the 2 suns created this amazing dance of light and shadow across the hull of the academy. And sometimes she would catch herself staring out during boring parts of lectures, though she tried not to do that too much since Professor Velxis had compound eyes that could see in multiple directions at once, and he definitely noticed when students were not paying attention and would call them out in front of everyone, which was embarrassing no matter what species you belonged to. And Minji wanted to maintain her good standing in the class, because she was one of only 5 humans at the entire academy, and she felt like she was representing Earth every single day, which was a lot of pressure, honestly. But she tried not to think about it too much, and just focus on learning as much as she could while she was here, because opportunities like this did not come around very often for humans, since Earth had only joined the galactic community about 70 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers by most of the older species who had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even invented the wheel. Her classmate Bora slithered into the seat next to her, and the Kolari girl looked more nervous than usual, with her gills fluttering rapidly against the sides of her long neck, which Minji had learned was a sign of anxiety in their species, and Bora's skin had taken on a pale greenish color instead of her normal vibrant blue-green that she showed when she was happy and relaxed. And Minji felt bad for her friend, because Bora had failed the last simulation exercise when they had to escape from a flooding chamber, and even though it was supposed to be her species' natural element, she had panicked because the water had been too cold and the wrong pH level for Quilari biology, and she had needed medical attention afterward. And Minji knew that Bora was terrified of failing another simulation, because one more failure would mean remedial courses and a delayed graduation, and nobody wanted that when they were so close to finishing their training and getting their first assignments in the field. "Hey, Bora," Minji said quietly as she opened her lunchbox to check on her sandwich, because sometimes the container would shift in her backpack during the walk from the dorms and things would get squished. But today, everything looked perfect, with the bright green jalapeno slices arranged neatly on top of the protein paste that passed for turkey in the galactic marketplace, and some earth lettuce that the hydroponics team grew specially for the human cadets, and a bit of that fermented cabbage called kimchi that Jinwoo had made last month and shared with all the humans because he said it reminded him of his mother's cooking back in Busan, and Minji agreed that it tasted pretty close to the real thing, though nothing could quite match actual Earth-made food, and she was looking forward to her vacation trip home in 6 months if she passed all her finals. Professor Velxis entered the classroom through the faculty door, and his crystalline exoskeleton caught the light from the binary stars outside and scattered it across the walls in rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful if not for the serious expression on his face that Minji could read, even though Velcrin facial features were very different from human ones, because she had learned to interpret the subtle color shifts in their transparent shells that indicated mood and right. Now Velxis was showing deep purple streaks, which meant he was in full professional mode, and expected everyone to pay close attention to today's lesson, and the nervous energy in the room increased immediately as students from various species shifted in their seats or adjusted their breathing apparatus or fluffed their feathers depending on what their particular biology looked like. "Good morning, cadets," Velxus said in his resonant voice that came from vibrating chambers in his thorax, rather than vocal cords like humans had, and the translation device in Minji's ear converted his speech into Korean, though she had been practicing, understanding Velkrin directly because it was considered polite to at least try to learn the languages of the species you worked with, and she was getting pretty good at it, even if she could not produce the sounds herself without mechanical help. "Today we will conduct the mandatory Class 7 neurotoxin exposure simulation," he continued, and the room went completely silent except for the hum of the air recyclers and the distant sound of the station's engines maintaining their orbit, and Minji could feel the tension radiating from every student around her, because Class 7 was serious business, and everyone knew it from the safety briefings they had sat through at the beginning of the term. Velxus moved to the center of the room where a holographic display activated showing molecular structures and biological response charts, and he began explaining in careful detail exactly what they would be exposed to during the simulation and how it would affect different species in different ways and what the proper emergency response protocols were if anyone started showing severe symptoms, and he emphasized that this was a controlled environment with medical teams standing by and that the toxin was carefully measured to be unpleasant but not actually dangerous as long as everyone followed the safety procedures and activated their counteragent injectors at the first sign of distress. Minji listened carefully while unwrapping her sandwich because she figured she might as well eat now, since lunch period was not for another 3 hours, and she was already hungry from skipping breakfast after sleeping through her alarm that morning. And the sandwich smelled amazing with those jalapeños adding that perfect sharp spicy scent that made her mouth water. And she took a big bite just as Velxus started describing the symptoms of neurotoxin exposure, which included seizures and respiratory failure and something called cellular cascade breakdown that sounded really unpleasant. But Minji trusted that the professor knew what he was doing, and that the medical teams were as good as everyone said they were. Around her, the other students were preparing themselves mentally for the simulation, and Bora was doing those breathing exercises that Kilari used to calm their nervous systems, and the Thrace student named Chitrix was checking and rechecking his emergency injector with his many-fingered hands, and the Sorel representative, whose name was Wind Whisper, was humming a low-frequency tune that her species used for emotional regulation, and everyone seemed to understand that this was going to be a difficult experience, but it was necessary training for the kind of work they all wanted to do. Professor Velxus moved toward the control panel on the wall, and his crystalline fingers danced across the interface as he activated the simulation chamber protocols, and Minji watched with interest while chewing another bite of her sandwich because she had never actually seen a toxin simulation before, and she was curious about how it would work exactly, and whether it would feel like anything at all or just be one of those things where you suddenly realized something was wrong with your body and had to react quickly before the symptoms got worse. Like that time she had eaten bad shellfish at the beach when she was 12 and spent the whole night feeling miserable until her mom took her to the clinic. The walls of the classroom began to shimmer and shift as the environmental controls engaged and sealed the room into a proper simulation chamber, with reinforced atmospheric containment and medical sensor arrays that would monitor every student's vital signs throughout the exercise, and Minji could see the small holographic displays appearing next to each student, showing their baseline readings for heart rate and respiration, and neural activity, and blood chemistry, and all the other biological markers that the Academy used to ensure nobody actually got hurt during these training exercises, even though they were supposed to be realistic enough to prepare you for actual field conditions where you might not have a medical team standing by ready to help. "Initiating toxin release in 10 seconds, Velxus announced, and his voice had taken on that formal tone that professors used when they were following official safety protocols, and Minji noticed that he had moved to stand behind a transparent barrier that separated the instructor station from the main classroom area, and she wondered briefly if that meant the simulation was going to be more intense than she had expected, but she pushed the thought aside and took another bite of her sandwich, because worrying would not help, and she might as well enjoy her lunch while she could. The countdown display appeared in the air above them, showing numbers descending from 10 to 9 to 8, and Minji could hear Bora's breathing getting faster next to her, and Chitrix was gripping his desk with enough force that the metal was starting to bend slightly under his insectoid claws, and even Wind Whisper had stopped her calming hum and was staring straight ahead with her large avian eyes wide and unblinking, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, as her grandmother used to say. At 0, the vents in the ceiling opened with a soft hiss, and purple mist began flowing into the room like fog rolling across a lake in the early morning, and it spread quickly, filling the space from top to bottom, and Minji watched it swirl around her arms and face, and it had a slightly sweet smell that reminded her of artificial grape flavoring, mixed with something metallic and sharp, and she wrinkled her nose because it was not exactly pleasant, but it was not terrible either. And she went back to eating her sandwich while the mist continued to thicken around everyone. Then the screaming started, and Bora suddenly convulsed in her seat with her whole body going rigid, and her gills flaring open wide as she struggled to breathe, and her skin was flashing through colors rapidly from blue to green to yellow to a sickly gray. And Minji started to reach out to help her friend, but Velxus's voice came through the speakers, telling everyone to remain in their seats and let the medical protocols handle any distress and trust the training and follow the procedures they had learned. Chitrix collapsed forward onto his desk, and his breathing made horrible whistling sounds through his thorax, and his compound eyes had lost their normal shine and looked dull and unfocused, and across the room 3 other students were also showing severe symptoms, with one of them actually falling out of their chair completely and hitting the floor with a heavy thud that made Minji wince in sympathy, even though she knew the medical teams were already responding because she could see the ceiling panels opening up and robotic medical drones descending on thin cables to scan and treat the affected students. The purple mist was everywhere now, and Minji breathed it in with every breath as she chewed her sandwich and watched the chaos unfold around her, and she felt kind of bad that she was just sitting there eating while her classmates were suffering. But Velxus had said to stay in her seat and follow protocols, and she was not feeling any symptoms at all, except maybe a slight warmth in her throat that was probably from the jalapeños, rather than the neurotoxin, because that was exactly what jalapeños felt like when you ate them, and she had been eating them her whole life and knew the sensation well. More students were going down now, and the medical drones were working frantically to administer counteragents and stabilize vital signs. And Wind Whisper had fallen from her perch and lay on the floor making terrible discordant sounds instead of her usual harmonious chirps, and the Velcrin student 2 rows ahead was showing cracks in his exoskeleton that were leaking some kind of clear fluid, and even the sturdy rock-like Gren student, who everyone said could survive anything, was curled up in a ball whimpering, which was disturbing because Gren never showed weakness ever. Professor Velxus was behind his barrier working multiple control panels at once, and his color had shifted to emergency orange, and he was speaking rapidly into a communication device calling for additional medical support from the main medical bay, and the observation gallery above the classroom had filled with other professors and staff members, all looking down with concerned expressions and pointing at various students and talking urgently among themselves. Minji finished her sandwich and wiped her hands on a napkin and looked around at the chaos and wondered when the simulation was supposed to affect her, because so far, she felt completely fine, except for that warmth in her throat, which was definitely just the jalapeños because she had put extra ones on today, and they were the spicy variety that Jinwoo had gotten from the Earth food supply shipment last month, and those ones always had more kick than the mild peppers from the hydroponics bay. The medical teams had arrived now with actual living doctors and nurses in addition to the drones, and they were moving through the classroom treating students and checking vitals and administering more counteragents and calling out medical terminology that Minji did not fully understand but which sounded very serious and urgent, and she counted quickly in her head and realized that 17 of the 20 students in the room were either unconscious or in obvious medical distress, and the only ones who seemed okay were herself and 2 students who were sitting very still and quiet in the corner looking scared, but not actually showing symptoms yet. Then Velxus noticed her, and his whole body went rigid and his color shifted from emergency orange to a confused yellow-green that Minji had never seen before, and he was staring at her through the barrier with all his eyes focused on her position, and she wondered if maybe she had done something wrong by eating during the simulation. But nobody had said she could not eat, and she had been hungry, and it seemed like a waste to let good food go cold. "Cadet Minji," Velxus said through the speakers, and his voice sounded strange, like he was trying to stay calm, but was actually quite disturbed by something, and Minji sat up straighter in her chair and tried to look professional, even though she was surrounded by chaos and medical emergencies. "Yes, Professor," she replied clearly. "Are you experiencing any symptoms?" he asked. Minji considered the question carefully and took stock of her body and how it felt, and she was completely honest when she answered, "No, sir, just a little bit of warmth in my throat, but that is from the jalapeños in my sandwich." There was a long silence, and everyone who was conscious and capable of looking in her direction was now staring at her, including the medical staff who had paused in their treatments to turn and look at the human girl sitting calmly in her seat, surrounded by purple toxic mist that had put down 17 of her classmates. Velxis checked his control panel and then checked it again and then called over another professor from the observation gallery, and they both studied the readings together and talked in low voices that Minji could not quite hear, even though her translator was working perfectly fine and she felt awkward just sitting there being stared at. So she reached into her lunchbox and pulled out the small container of extra jalapeños she had brought. "Does anyone want jalapeños?" she called out, holding up the container and looking around at her classmates. "I brought extra." 2 security officers escorted Minji through the academy corridors toward Medical Bay 7, and she carried her lunchbox because nobody had told her to leave it behind, and she figured she might get hungry later since it was still 3 hours until official lunch period, and the morning had already been pretty weird with the whole toxin simulation thing, and now everyone was acting like she had done something wrong, even though she had just sat in her seat and followed Professor Velxis's instructions to stay put and not panic, and she thought she had actually done pretty well considering all her classmates had been collapsing and screaming around her. The medical bay doors opened with a soft whoosh and Dr. Hyan looked up from her desk, where she had been reviewing something on multiple holographic screens, and her face showed surprise and then concern when she saw Minji being brought in by security, like some kind of criminal, and Minji felt relieved to see another human because Dr. Hyan had been at the academy for 12 years and knew how things worked and could probably explain what was going on. "What happened?" Dr. Hyan asked in Korean, which was nice because even though Minji's translator worked fine, it was always easier to talk in your native language, especially when you were confused and a little bit worried about why security had escorted you out of class. "There was a toxin simulation in advanced toxicology and everyone got really sick, but I felt fine and now they want to examine me, I think," Minji explained. Dr. Hyan's expression shifted to something complicated that Minji could not quite read, and she dismissed the security officers with a wave of her hand and gestured for Minji to sit on the examination platform in the center of the room, and the platform hummed to life as soon as Minji settled onto it and began running scans that tickled slightly as they passed through her body, measuring everything from her bone density to her neural activity. "Tell me exactly what happened," Dr. Hyan said while watching the scan results appear on her screens. Minji explained about the Class 7 neurotoxin simulation and how Professor Velxis had warned them all about the symptoms and how the purple mist had filled the room and how Bora and Chitrix and basically everyone else had collapsed or started seizing or showing obvious signs of distress, and how the medical teams had rushed in to help, and how she had just sat there eating her sandwich with jalapeños because she had not felt anything wrong at all, except the normal warmth from the peppers. "You ate jalapeños during a neurotoxin exposure," Dr. Hyan said slowly. "Yes, I brought extra and I even offered to share, but nobody wanted any," Minji replied. Dr. Hyan made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely, and she pulled up more screens and started typing rapidly and muttering to herself in Korean about molecular structures and evolutionary biology and capsaicin receptors and a bunch of other technical terms that Minji had heard before in her biology classes but did not fully understand. The examination platform completed its scans and produced a detailed holographic model of Minji's body, showing all her internal systems in different colors, and Dr. Hyan studied it carefully and zoomed in on various parts and cross-referenced something with the Galactic Medical Database and then made several phone calls to other doctors and professors using her communication device and speaking in that fast, urgent way that medical professionals used when something important was happening. Within 20 minutes, the medical bay had filled with people, and not just medical staff but also Professor Velxis, who had apparently left the cleanup of the simulation to his assistants so he could come examine the human who had not reacted to his toxin, and several members of the Galactic Council's Education Oversight Committee, who were very concerned about the safety protocols at the Academy and whether there had been some kind of malfunction in the simulation equipment. The simulation equipment worked perfectly, Velxis said, and his color was still that confused yellow-green. The toxin concentration was exactly as programmed and the dispersal pattern was optimal, and every sensor confirms that Cadet Minji was exposed to the same concentration as all the other students. Then why is she not affected? Demanded one of the committee members, who was a tall, elegant being from a species Minji did not recognize. Dr. Hyun pulled up a new set of holographic displays and began what turned out to be a very long and complicated explanation about human biology and Earth's evolutionary history, and Minji found herself feeling embarrassed as the doctor described how humans regularly consumed substances that would be lethal to most other species in the galaxy. Capsaicin from peppers registers as a painful stimulus to human nerve receptors, but humans actively seek it out for the endorphin release it triggers, Dr. Hine explained. We also regularly consume ethanol, which is a literal poison that damages cellular function, but we drink it socially and recreationally, and we have an entire industry built around producing and distributing it in various forms. The committee members looked shocked, and one of them actually backed away from Minji like she might be contagious. The Class 7 neurotoxin used in the simulation, Dr. Hyen continued, while pulling up molecular structure diagrams, shares significant structural similarities with capsaicin, and it triggers similar receptor responses in most species. But in humans, those receptors are already adapted to handle capsaicin exposure, and the human nervous system essentially interprets the neurotoxin as mild spiciness rather than as a dangerous poison. Professor Velxis was studying the molecular diagrams with intense focus, and his color had shifted to deep contemplative blue. You are saying that what we classify as a Class 7 restricted neurotoxin is functionally equivalent to what humans put on their food for flavor. Not exactly equivalent, but close enough that human biology does not register it as a threat, Dr. Hyun confirmed. There was a long silence while everyone processed this information, and Minji felt very self-conscious sitting on the examination platform while a dozen important people stared at her like she was some kind of alien specimen, which was ironic, considering she was surrounded by actual aliens. News of the incident spread through the academy faster than a computer virus, and by the time Minji was released from medical bay and allowed to return to her dorm, the entire station seemed to know about the human who ate jalapeños during a neurotoxin simulation and survived without any symptoms, and she could not walk through a corridor without other students stopping and staring and whispering to each other. Jinwoo found her in the human common area that evening, and he was grinning like someone had told him the best joke in the universe. "You are famous," he said. "Everyone is talking about how you offered jalapeños to people who were literally dying from poison exposure." "I did not know they were dying," Minji protested. "I thought it was just supposed to be uncomfortable." "Well, now the whole Galactic Council is having an emergency meeting about human biology and whether Earth should be reclassified as a more dangerous world, and there are professors calling their colleagues at other institutions trying to figure out what other crazy things humans can survive that would kill normal people," Jinwoo said, and he was clearly enjoying the chaos. He pulled out his personal datapad and showed Minji a file he had been working on titled Earth Foods That Are Galactic Hazards, and it was already 23 pages long with detailed descriptions of chocolate and coffee and alcohol and garlic, and onions and mint and dozens of other common Earth items that apparently contained compounds that other species used as pesticides or antimicrobial agents or industrial solvents. "This is insane," Minji said while scrolling through the list. "This is amazing," Jinwoo corrected. "Do you realize what this means for humanity's reputation in the galaxy? And we have only been part of the galactic community for 70 years, and already we are known as the species that casually eats poison for fun." Over the next few days, the investigation continued, and Dr. Hyon worked with teams of xenobiologists and chemists and evolutionary specialists to document human tolerances for various substances, and Minji had to sit through dozens of interviews and examinations and tests where they exposed her to tiny amounts of different compounds to see how her body reacted, and every time the researchers were shocked by how much humans could handle without showing distress. Professor Velxis completely revised his toxicology curriculum, and added an entire new section on Death World species adaptations, and he used humans as the primary example of how evolutionary pressure from a hostile environment could produce beings with remarkable resilience, and the Academy administration started discussing whether they needed separate safety protocols for human students. The Academy announced an emergency symposium on human biology and comparative toxicology 3 weeks after the simulation incident, and attendance was mandatory for all faculty and optional for students, but the main auditorium filled up anyway, because everyone wanted to understand how humans could be so different from every other species in the galactic community. And Minji sat in the back row trying to be inconspicuous while Dr. Hyun prepared her presentation on the main stage. The lights dimmed and holographic displays activated, showing Earth rotating slowly in space, and Dr. Hyun began speaking in that calm, professional voice she used when she was in full scientist mode, and Minji had heard her practice parts of this presentation over the past few weeks, but seeing it all together was somehow more impressive and more terrifying, because Dr. Hyun was essentially explaining to the entire Academy why humans were walking chemical weapons factories. Earth's evolutionary history is characterized by extreme competition and environmental hostility, Dr. Hyun said, while the hologram shifted to show various predators and parasites and toxic plants that had existed on Earth throughout human development. Humans evolved alongside creatures that wanted to eat them, and plants that wanted to poison them, and microorganisms that wanted to infect them, and this constant pressure created a species with remarkably robust immune systems and chemical tolerance. She pulled up charts showing human liver function and kidney filtration and the blood-brain barrier, and explained how each system was designed to process and eliminate toxins efficiently, and how humans had developed the ability to detect dangerous substances through taste and smell, but had also learned to override those warnings when the substances provided some benefit, like caffeine for alertness or alcohol for social bonding. To demonstrate human chemical tolerance, I have prepared a practical example with Cadet Minji's permission, Dr. Hyun said, and gestured for Minji to come down to the stage. Minji felt her face get hot as she walked down the aisle with everyone watching, and she climbed onto the stage where Dr. Hyun had set up a small cooking station with various ingredients and equipment, and Minji suddenly understood what was about to happen, and she was not sure whether to be excited or embarrassed. Minji will now prepare a traditional human meal that her species considers mildly spicy, Dr. Hyun announced. I want everyone to observe the chemical sensors that will analyze the compounds being released during cooking. Minji started making curry using the recipe her mother had taught her when she was 10 years old, and she kept it simple because she did not want to traumatize anyone with the really spicy versions her grandmother preferred, and she added cumin and coriander and turmeric, and just a little bit of chili powder and some garlic and ginger, and as she cooked, the air filled with aromas that made her homesick, but apparently made everyone else in the auditorium very nervous. The chemical sensors were going absolutely crazy, and displaying warnings about toxic compound detection and recommended evacuation procedures, and Dr. Hyun had to override the safety systems 3 times to prevent automatic containment protocols from activating and sealing the auditorium, and through it all, Minji just kept cooking and stirring and adding ingredients like she was making dinner in her apartment back in Seoul. As you can see, the sensors are detecting multiple compounds that are classified as irritants and antimicrobial agents and cellular toxins, Dr. Hyun explained, while pointing to the scrolling list of warnings. The capsaicin concentration alone would require hazmat containment for most species, but Minji considers this barely spicy. Minji finished cooking and served herself a bowl and sat down at a table on the stage and began eating while the audience watched through the reinforced observation glass that had automatically deployed when the sensors hit critical warning levels, and she tried not to think about how weird it was to eat curry while hundreds of people stared at her like she was performing some kind of death-defying stunt. The curry was good, though, maybe not quite as good as her mom's version, because the proteins available at the Academy were not exactly the same as Earth chicken, but it was close enough and the spices were right, and that familiar warmth spread through her mouth and throat, and she felt comforted by the taste of home. After the demonstration, several students approached Minji with questions, and one of them was Bora, who had fully recovered from the simulation incident and was working on a xenocultural studies project about human dietary habits and survival strategies. And Minji agreed to do an interview because Bora had become a good friend, despite their very different biologies. They sat in one of the study lounges with Bora's recording device between them and talked for over 2 hours about Earth and human culture and the kinds of things humans did that seemed normal to them but shocked other species, and Minji found herself explaining concepts that she had never really thought about before. Why do humans exercise until their muscles tear? Bora asked with genuine confusion in her large eyes. Because that is how muscles get stronger, Minji said. The tears heal, and the muscle rebuilds itself bigger and stronger than before. But does that not hurt? Bora said. Yes, it hurts, but we call it good pain because it means we are getting stronger, Minji explained, and she could see that Bora did not understand at all because Quillari biology did not work that way, and they grew stronger by eating specific nutrients and swimming in properly balanced water, not by deliberately damaging their own bodies. Bora asked about human recreation, and Minji described things like rock climbing and skydiving and martial arts and long-distance running. And with each example, Bora looked more and more disturbed, until finally she said, humans seek out activities that elevate stress hormones and heart rate and risk physical injury for fun. I guess when you put it that way, it does sound kind of crazy, Minji admitted. But it feels good to push yourself and overcome challenges and test your limits. The interview revealed something that Minji had not fully understood before, which was that human psychology was just as unusual as human biology, and the human drive to seek challenges and overcome obstacles and constantly push boundaries was not universal across species. And many galactic civilizations found humans exhausting, because they could never just be satisfied with safety and comfort and stability. Jinwu's list of dangerous Earth foods kept growing as more researchers examined human dietary habits. And it turned out that humans consumed an astonishing array of substances that required special handling in galactic commerce, and chocolate became a restricted substance after someone calculated how much theobromine it contained and realized that a standard human candy bar had enough to kill several small aliens, and coffee got classified as a stimulant drug that needed import licenses, and fermented foods like kimchi and yogurt were treated as controlled bacterial cultures that required quarantine inspection. Professor Velxis invited Minji to guest lecture in his toxicology class about human poison resistance, and she stood in front of her peers trying to explain how humans had turned evolutionary pressure into biological advantage, and how Earth's harsh conditions had forced humanity to become adaptable and resilient, and how that resilience was not about being superior to other species, but about surviving circumstances that would have destroyed less flexible species. Every species evolves to match their environment, she said. Quillari are perfect for aquatic worlds, and Sorel are perfect for high-atmosphere flying, and Velcrin are perfect for mineral-rich crystalline environments, and humans are perfect for worlds where everything is trying to kill you and you have to eat poison and damage your muscles, and take risks just to survive another day. The Galactic Council convened multiple sessions to discuss the implications of human biology for interstellar safety regulations and trade agreements and diplomatic protocols, and there was serious debate about whether Earth should be reclassified as a Class 9 death world, which was the highest danger rating in the galactic cataloging system, and had never been applied to a world that produced sentient spacefaring life before, because most Class 9 worlds killed anything that tried to evolve. Intelligence. 3 weeks after the symposium, the Galactic Academy implemented sweeping changes to accommodate human biology and safety protocols, and Minji returned to her regular classes to find that everything was different now, because there were special warning labels on simulation equipment and revised emergency procedures posted in every classroom, and a whole new section in the student handbook dedicated to Death World species integration, and she was simultaneously proud and embarrassed to be the reason for all these changes. Professor Velxis had completely redesigned his toxicology curriculum, and humans now had separate simulation parameters, because exposing them to the same substances that affected other species was pointless when those substances just tasted mildly spicy to human biology. And Minji sat through a new version of the Class 7 neurotoxin simulation that actually used compounds that could affect humans, and she had to admit it was much more educational when she could actually feel the symptoms. Starting and had to properly use the counteragent injector and follow emergency protocols instead of just sitting there eating lunch. The Academy created the first Death World species integration program with humans as the pilot case, and Dr. Hyon became the director of the program, which meant she would be developing protocols for any future species from hostile worlds that might join the galactic community. And Minji thought it was funny that humans were considered so dangerous that they needed their own integration program. But she understood the reasoning, because the differences between human biology and everyone else's biology were not just interesting academic facts but actual safety concerns that affected how humans could interact with other species. A xenobiology observer named Taewon was assigned to follow Minji through her daily routine and document human physiological responses for the Galactic Medical Database. And Taewon was a young Velcrin researcher who found everything humans did absolutely fascinating and slightly terrifying, and he carried sensor equipment everywhere, recording data about how Minji's body processed food and regulated temperature and responded to stress. And it was annoying at first, but Minji got used to having him around. During a field exercise on hazardous environment protocols, Minji made the mistake of offering to share her trail mix with other students, and Taewon's sensors immediately started screaming warnings because the trail mix contained chocolate and almonds and dried cranberries, and each of those ingredients was classified as a restricted substance for various reasons. And the exercise instructor had to intervene and explain to Minji that she could not just casually distribute what the galactic community considered controlled substances even if humans thought of them as healthy snacks. The chocolate alone contains enough theobromine to cause cardiac arrest in 6 different species represented in this class, the instructor said while carefully sealing Minji's trail mix in a containment bag. And the almonds contain cyanogenic compounds that require specialized metabolic processing that most species lack. Minji apologized and felt terrible about almost accidentally poisoning her classmates with her snacks. And from that point on, she was very careful to only eat human food in designated areas and never offer to share unless she had checked with medical staff first about whether it was safe for the recipient species. The broader implications of human biology rippled through galactic society in unexpected ways, and there was a diplomatic incident when a human cargo ship tried to pass through customs with standard Earth spices, and the customs officials classified the entire shipment as bioweapons and demanded it be destroyed, and it took 3 weeks of negotiations and testimony from Dr. Hyun before the shipment was released, with proper hazardous materials, labeling, and restrictions. Restaurants that wanted to serve human cuisine had to get special licenses and install proper ventilation systems and post-warning signs and acquire hazmat insurance, and some species governments banned human food imports entirely because they could not guarantee the safety of their populations if Earth products entered their ecosystems. And Minji read articles about how her favorite kimchi was causing interstellar trade disputes, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry. Coffee became regulated like antimatter because the caffeine concentration in standard human beverages was enough to cause fatal cardiac events in most species, and there were proposals to restrict human access to coffee synthesis equipment, but the human delegation to the Galactic Council threatened to withdraw from several treaties if coffee was banned, and eventually a compromise was reached where humans could have coffee, but it had to be prepared in sealed containers with proper disposal protocols for any waste. But understanding grew alongside the regulations and restrictions, and Minji noticed that her classmates stopped looking at her with fear and started asking questions with genuine curiosity about what it was like to grow up on a world where everything was dangerous and how humans had learned to thrive in those conditions and what Earth was really like beyond the dry scientific descriptions in the databases. Bora finished her thesis on convergent evolution and survival strategies, and she presented it at a student research symposium. And her main argument was that humanity's resilience came not from being better than other species, but from being forced to adapt to circumstances that would have driven other species extinct, and that this made humans valuable partners in the galactic community, because they could survive and function in environments that would be fatal to almost everyone else. Chitrix, the Thrace student, collaborated with Jinwoo on a comparative nutrition study examining how different species processed energy from food, and they discovered that human metabolism was incredibly efficient at extracting calories from a wide variety of sources, including things that other species could not digest at all, like certain plant fibers and complex carbohydrates, and their paper was published in a xenobiology journal and became required reading in several academy courses. Professor Velxis revised the entire academy curriculum to incorporate human survival strategies while respecting biological diversity, and he developed new teaching methods that acknowledged that different species had different strengths and weaknesses, and that what worked for one species might be completely inappropriate for another. And Minji watched as the toxicology program transformed from a one-size-fits-all approach to a flexible adaptive system that prepared students for real-world conditions, where you might be working alongside beings with completely different biological needs. The neurotoxin simulation got a complete overhaul with species-specific variants that challenged each student appropriately, and humans now faced actual toxins that could affect them rather than capsaicin analogs. And Minji took the updated simulation 5 months after the original incident, and this time she felt her heart rate increase and her vision blur, and her hands start to shake, and she had to follow proper emergency protocols and administer the counter agent and complete the breathing exercises, and it was difficult and uncomfortable and educational in all the ways the original simulation had not been. Later that day, she sat in the cafeteria with Bora and Chitrix and Wind Whisper and several other classmates, and they were all talking about the new simulation and comparing experiences, and Minji pulled out her container of jalapeños, and Bora immediately laughed and said, "Are you seriously still eating those after everything that happened?" "Of course," Minji said. "They are delicious and they remind me of home." Chitrix had recently acquired taste-blocking medication that allowed him to eat small amounts of capsaicin without his nervous system interpreting it as a deadly poison, and he cautiously tried one of Minji's jalapeños, and his compound eyes went wide, and he made a chittering sound that his species used to express surprise, and he said, "I can see why humans like these, and they make my mouth feel warm." Wind Whisper tried one next with her own set of protective medications, and she hummed a pleased harmonic and said through her translator that the pepper had an interesting flavor profile that reminded her of certain flowers on her homeworld, and gradually the jalapeños that had once symbolized the terrifying difference between humans and everyone else became a symbol of cross-species friendship and the willingness to understand and appreciate differences, even when those differences were strange or frightening. 5 months after the original incident, Minji stood with her graduating class at the Academy's ceremony hall and received her certification in xenodiplomatic services, and she had passed all her exams and completed all her simulations and learned more about herself and her species and the galaxy than she had ever imagined possible. And Professor Velxis gave a speech about diversity and resilience, and how one human's casual lunch choice had revolutionized their understanding of life's incredible variety across the stars. The audience applauded with whatever appendages their species used for applause, and Minji saw representatives from dozens of different species watching, and she saw her parents who had traveled from Earth for the ceremony, and she saw Dr. Hyun looking proud, and she saw Jinwoo grinning and holding up a small container, and she knew without looking that it contained jalapeños, because some traditions were worth keeping no matter how many species they horrified.